Hello everyone and welcome back to Whisky Wednesday. I have more Scottish whisky for all of you. We've been very heavy on Irish and American recently, so we've gone back to Scotch. This is a bottle I've loaned from a friend because I was amazed to see that he had it. This is Bunnahabhain 18. 46.3%, all natural colour, all non-chill filtered, all the good things that we like as whisky drinkers these days. A bottle of whiskey I haven't spent a huge amount of time with. Just let that sit in the glass for a bit. Let's talk about Bunnahabhain. The 18 is now an allocated product, so it's only released, I believe, twice a year. I could be wrong about that, but it's not released all the time anymore. 18-year-old whiskies are getting a bit like that, especially from smaller distilleries. Always loved Bunnahabhain 12, although they are a company, or a distillery, I should say, which goes through quite a lot of batch variation. Now, that is just an inherent problem of whiskey. These things happen, and we should all be prepared for it. I think we should all be a bit less upset if a slightly unusual batch comes out, because at the end of the day, a distillery can only work with the casks that are there, especially in a facility, in this case, as small as Bunnahabhain. But I do like the 12-year-old. It's one of my sort of favourite introduction whiskies to give to people at tastings, and indeed recommend them to purchase, because it does a little bit of everything without being smoky, which is already quite a cool story for an Islay whiskey. I've tried to do some digging on this 18-year-old. From what I can find, most of the cask maturation is looking at 60% bourbon and 40% sherry, which I thought it would be flipped, but apparently not. I was wrong about that. But yeah, so 60% bourbon influence, 40% sherry influence. It does not state what the sherry is. And indeed, I don't think it goes into too much detail on the bottle about sherry influence, really. Matured exclusively. Oh, I stand corrected, folks. Always read a bottle first. Our 18-year-old is matured exclusively in ex-sherry casks. I stand corrected. So whoever wrote the review on it that it's 60% bourbon, 40% sherry, ignore that review. I won't name them. But this is matured exclusively in ex-sherry casks. Cut, edit, cut that. Which is interesting when you look at the colour. Fruit fly, go away. So, matured exclusively in ex-sherry. I'll make sure I say that a couple more times. And I've always found that when distilleries just state ex-sherry, it typically just means Oloroso. Pedro Jimenez is an expensive cask type and does a lot for colour and flavour. And if you're going to put it in there, most, I assume, would state. But with Bunnahabhain being particularly experimental, they've got a host of sherry and red wine casks and all kind of things in their distillery. So I think they would state so if they were saying it's a combo of bourbon, sherry and Pedro Jimenez, or Oloroso and Amontillado, or things like that. So it says ex-sherry. We're going to assume that it is exclusively Oloroso. But let's smell and taste and score. Now, I technically have reviewed this whiskey already. If any of you follow a channel called John Drinks, lovely Manchester fella based up in Edinburgh, he came to the whiskey shop and we shot some videos together, this being one of them, and it held us in a little bit of contention because it is a sherry matured style, but it isn't overly sweet. Now, Bunnahabhain, I've always described it as like salted chocolate and orange. You get these nice coastal influences without tons of peat, but the sherry always sings through. With this, and kind of like the Ben Romack 40 we put on Sample Sunday, there are some incredibly earthy notes to this, but I mean that in a sense of like nuttiness and herbs. I'll try and ream a few of them off for you. Fruit fly. I'm going to kill all of these fruit flies. So, let's cover that back up. Almonds. Not the most intense nut on its own, but there is a lovely kind of creamy almond nuttiness to the nose on this. That is backed up by some sweet notes, yes. Those are typically kind of really dark honey and like a toffee sauce, like a sticky toffee sauce. Accompanying that, you've also got this kind of really bright green apple note and that kind of tang of a pear. Like the first time you bite into a pear and you smell all that juice, there's also a note in there to it as well. The nuttiness thing, minus the almond, it reminds me very much of kind of hazelnut and macadamia. It's got this dryness to it, which is very apparent on the nose. There is salt, as you would imagine, which I think, if anything, amplifies those kind of nutty notes a lot more. And then we get into some quite classic sherry notes, really, which with this is kind of welcome. So things like dried cherries, raisin, classically. There's like a little bit of chocolate, there's some apricot, there's a little bit of sultana. There's kind of classic dried fruits with a bit of chocolate. But even with it being not a typically sweet nose for a sherry cask, I must say, still rather good. It's a minimum of 18 years old as well, so we have to think about that. I always have to remind myself, and indeed customers, whenever we see this age on the front of a bottle of whiskey, unless it is a single barrel, we know that the minimum age of this stuff is 18. So I always try and think, what would Bunnahabhain put in there to be a bit fun? Chances are most of it is 18 years old, but there could be some 19, 20, maybe some 21. Right, let's taste it. Ooh. The maltiness of this whiskey. It's unlike most things I've ever knowingly tried before. The texture is big and rich and silky. The texture actually reminds me a lot of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Like, just that kind of velvety approach it has. Kind of just covers the tongue. You don't really get any spice at all. It's only at the end now I'm getting like some oak spice. But it's so malty. Not creamy as such, but just very richly textured. And in a way which is quite unsimilar or dissimilar to the nose, we have more of just a significantly classic sherry approach. We've got those cherries and those raisins, that honey note comes back, nice little bits of toffee. The salt has gone away. The salt is more present on the nose than on the taste. But again, that could be amplifying the maltiness of it, just in terms of the texture. It isn't the longest finish in the world for an 18-year-old, but I'm not really going to mark it down for that because it's still a perfectly delicious whiskey. This, as a bottle, is about £120 in the UK. Insert the, I remember the day when this used to be £80 a bottle. And indeed, I do remember those days. But I also remember the days when Yamazaki 18 was £100, not £1,000, which is what it normally is now. Because it's only released twice a year, don't see that much of it, but it does still tend to move quite quickly from the shelves of the retailer I work for, and I think many others as well. I think there is a big element of respect to old Bunnahabhain, and given the pricing of current 18-year-old whiskey across the board, 120 kind of fits in with the norm. It's in the UK anyway. I think for that, if you're getting something which does state natural colour and non-chill filtered and is a little bit stronger in alcohol than your your Glenfiddicks and your Glenlivets and all these other whiskies, which are particularly famous, but I feel don't really try that hard with their 18-year-olds. But then again, they are made for a very specific market and a very specific type of customer. But overall, I think I'm going to give that a 9. It's a very, very, very good whiskey. I can't find flaws with it. Pricing is obviously subjective, depending on how much money you have to spend on an 18-year-old. But if you want a big, sherry, rich, real, like, after-dinner whiskey that isn't peated, I can't think of many of the things that will contend with this. GlenDronach 18 is significantly richer as a product, but I fell in and out of love with that whiskey constantly, and it hasn't really been available since November of last year. Apparently it's coming back, but we don't know when. But yeah, overall, I'm going to give that a 9 out of 10. I think that is a delicious whiskey, and if you like sherry and you like those salty coastal drams, why wouldn't you buy a bottle of that? But yes, thank you all for watching. This has been Whisky Wednesday. I'm Phil, and I will see you all next week. Cheers.